Hello, and welcome to Reasonable Accommodations in Employment, Supporting People with Disabilities to Decide When and How to Request. My name is Dr. Linda Ehrlich-Jones from the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, Knowledge Translation for the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Employment for Persons with Physical Disabilities, with Dr. Alan Heineman as the principal investigator. I would like to acknowledge and thank our funder, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research for their support of our work. Our speakers today are Drs. Mark Harniss and Heather Evans, and our speakers will be introducing themselves in a moment. A few housekeeping items. We have real-time captioning available. Please press the CC button to access the captioning that you'll find on the lower right of the screen. This session is being recorded and it will be posted on our website along with the slides after we're done. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation during the question and answer segment. There will be a website in the chat for you to complete an online evaluation, and we would appreciate your feedback. If you'd like to be added to our newsletter to find out about upcoming events, please indicate this on the evaluation form. And if you would like CRC, continuing education credit, please document this also on the evaluation form, and Deborah Crown will be in contact with you. I will now turn the microphone over to Mark.
Great. Thank you, Linda, and thank you all for attending today. We're really looking forward to talking with you about our project, which is focused on supporting people with disabilities in deciding when and how to request reasonable accommodation in employment. Next slide. Linda mentioned our funder, but we also want to thank and acknowledge ACL and NIDLR for their support of this project. Next slide. We wanted to start by talking a little bit about ourselves to give you some context for how we came to this work and our positionality. I'll start. For those who can't see me, I'm in my 50s with white skin, brown hair, and blue eyes. I use he, him pronouns. I'm wearing a blue shirt and reading glasses with transparent frames, and I'm in front of a blurred background. I'm an associate professor in rehabilitation medicine, but I initially trained in and have worked in the field of special education. I've worked as an educator and a researcher in fields addressing disability for about 25 years on projects that involved curriculum design, assistive technology, and knowledge translation. In the past 6 years, I've engaged with the field of disability studies and have really enjoyed applying that perspective to my work, in particular because disability studies critiques and questions the fields of rehabilitation and special education. And I'm currently director of the University of Washington Academic Disability Studies program. I came to this specific work through my position as PI of the NIDLR-funded Americans with Disabilities Act Knowledge Translation Center, which is one of 11 centers funded by NIDLR to support implementation of the ADA. And in our center, we observed that there are still lots and lots of people who are seeking technical assistance related to reasonable accommodations, and that even with support, many of them are still finding it difficult to negotiate the process. I do not myself identify as a person with a disability, but I position myself as an ally. I attempt to center the perspectives of people with disabilities in my work, and I try to elevate their voices. You may note that I use person-first language. I use people with disabilities. I'm more comfortable with that. Both because of my professional experience and probably because of my age. I remember when person first became accepted terminology. But I'm going to turn it over to Heather, who's going to talk about her preference for identity first language and her connection to this project. So Heather.
Thanks, Mark. So yes, I am Heather Evans. For those of you who can't see this image, there's an image of me on the screen. I am a white woman with short brown graying hair. I have green eyes, I wear glasses, and on this particular image, I am standing against a backdrop that is a blurred building on our campus. Just as way of introduction, I'm a sociologist by training, and I am an acting assistant professor in the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine at the University of Washington. I work with Dr. Harniss. I have two areas of specialization. One is critical disability studies, which really in that area I focus on disclosure decisions, disability identity management. And then the second area that I really focus on is socio-legal studies. Socio-legal meaning not so much focused on law on the books, so much as law on the ground. That is how laws actually play out in the lives of everyday people. I myself identify as a disabled person, so I have professional as well as personal investments in this work. And kind of building off of what Mark just said, I also wanted to briefly address language and the language that we'll be using in this presentation. So as Mark mentioned, many of my colleagues, particularly in the STEM fields, have become accustomed to using person-first language, again, to speak about a person with a disability in the field of critical disability studies. And when you hear critical in front of any academic field, you might think of critical race studies or critical gender studies. So in that field, we generally use identity first language. So for example, I just introduced myself as a disabled person because it's an identity that I hold and it's one that's very important to me. And we're sharing this information not to suggest that one way is appropriate or better, but simply to acknowledge that both of these kinds of phrases are used. They're both used respectfully, they're perfectly appropriate. And in this presentation, Dr. Harniss and I will probably use these terms somewhat interchangeably. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Mark, and he's going to introduce you to the tool that we're working on.
Great, thank you, Heather. Next slide. So we have three objectives today. We will discuss the reasonable accommodation process and key decision points within the process. We'll discuss the complexities of that process and the lived experiences of people with disabilities, in particular, the psychosocial dynamics that affect decision-making. And then we'll talk about a tool that we're developing that we hope will support people in making decisions about how and when to make a reasonable accommodation decision. Next slide. I would guess that many on this webinar are very familiar with the concept of reasonable accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. The law defines reasonable accommodations as modifications to the job application process that enable a qualified applicant with a disability to be considered, modifications to the work environment or the way the position is customarily performed that enable an individual with disability to perform essential functions of the position, and modifications that allow an employee with disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. And under the ADA, employers who have 15 or more employees are usually required to provide reasonable accommodations, although some state and local laws may require that employers with fewer employees provide reasonable accommodations. Reasonable accommodations may include, but are not limited to, making facilities accessible and usable by individuals with disabilities, or a number of changes to the job or job environment, like job restructuring, part-time or modified work schedules, reassignment to a vacant position, acquisition or modifications of equipment or devices, appropriate adjustment or modification of examinations, training materials or policies, the provision of qualified readers or interpreters, and other similar accommodations for individuals with disabilities. The reasonable accommodation process begins with disclosure of disability, because employers are only required to accommodate disabilities that they're aware of. And of course, you know that some disabilities are visible and others are not. So some people just disclose just by entering a room, while others have to actively disclose a disability. So the next step in the process is that the employer and employee hopefully engage in an interactive dialogue to understand the barrier and the potential accommodation solutions. If necessary, documentation may be requested from a health or rehabilitation professional, and then the accommodation is implemented or denied. Ideally, that interactive process continues and the effectiveness of the accommodation is assessed, and it might be adjusted or modified over time. Next slide. Note that reasonable accommodations are a certain kind of conceptualization of equality or equity. They're designed to provide equal access. Some other terms that you hear are they allow people in the door, they level the playing field. So they're a way for folks to have barriers removed, but the employee still needs to be qualified for and able to perform essential functions of the job within this reasonable accommodation process. Next slide. So described that way, reasonable accommodations may seem fairly straightforward, but once you dig deeper, you realize that there are many challenges facing people with disabilities as they attempt to request reasonable accommodations in employment. And a metaphor that we find useful is to think about the iceberg of reasonable accommodations. So even on the surface, icebergs are formidable, right? And that can be true of the reasonable accommodation process too. So people with disabilities have to understand the law and how it protects their rights. They need to understand how it applies to them and their situation. And they need to understand whether they're qualified and what essential duties are of their job. They have to understand both the general process of requesting, but they may also have to think about how that works within their specific company through the HR administrative structures. And finally, they need to understand the concept of accommodations, the types of accommodations available, and they need to think about the accommodations that would work best for them. These are mostly information and knowledge issues, but they can be quite complex. Next slide. But as with real icebergs, the biggest part lies beneath the surface. And so there are things that are often not surfaced when we talk about the reasonable accommodation process. People come to the process with their own personal beliefs and values about disability identity. They may have complicated feelings about whether asking for a reasonable accommodation is a form of help seeking versus a form of rights activation. People make requests for accommodations in workplaces that are very different, and they may have legitimate concerns about fairness and about anticipated compliance. They worry about interpersonal relationships and how disclosure of disability and access to an accommodation may affect their relationships with a boss or a coworker. They may have legitimate fears about discrimination and retaliation, often based on experiences that they've had in other situations. And then all of this is complicated by type of disability. So we know that some disabilities are more stigmatized or more challenging to accommodate. And so people with different kinds of disabilities have different challenges around reasonable accommodation requests. Heather's going to talk more about these psychosocial issues when she describes findings from our interviews and focus groups in just a minute. Next slide. So given the complexity of the decisions that are associated with a request for reasonable accommodations, we wondered how we could provide more support to people with disabilities who are navigating the process. And in the health and medical fields, there's been a long history of developing patient decision aids that guide individuals through difficult health-related questions like, should I have this surgery? Should I take this medication? Should I engage in radiation therapy? And so on. Decision support aids are tools that guide individuals through a set of options, a set of choices. They provide information about pros and cons of each option. They elicit preferences. In other words, they're embedded in the lived experience of the individual. They support deliberation, and then they facilitate a decision. Ideally, they guide individuals through complicated choices and are intended to help them make value-based trade-offs between the benefits and harms of a decision. And they acknowledge that there often is no one correct decision, that there may be different decisions for different people who have different lived experiences in different contexts. And so they attempt to help an individual to understand information, but then apply that within their own situation. There's been quite a bit of research on decision aids, and the research shows there's good evidence that people who use decision aids improve their knowledge of options, they're better informed, they have more clarity about their own values, they have expectations about benefits and harms of treatment that are more accurate, and they participate more in decision making. So given these benefits, we decided to try to apply this decision aid framework to support decision-making related to reasonable accommodations. Next slide. At a very high level, there are 3 decision stages in the reasonable accommodation process. There's the stage before the request, when an individual needs to understand the process, decide whether to make a request, and if they are moving forward, how to make the best request. There's also a stage during the process of making the request when an individual needs to decide how to respond to requests for information. And then after the request, the individual needs to decide how to implement the accommodation if the request was successful, and what to do if the request was not successful. So these phases are part of the decision aid tool we're developing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of this presentation. Next slide. So to develop the decision aid, we've been working through a process that includes a scoping review of the research literature to help us understand what we know about reasonable accommodations, a series of focus groups and interviews with employers, people with disabilities, and vocational rehabilitation counselors to learn about their perspectives on challenges in making a request for accommodation. We are engaging in iterative design of the decision aid, working with the design team that is made up of individuals from those categories above. And then, and by the way, that's the stage we're currently in. And then once we have this completed, we'll be moving into user and expert testing and doing some small proof of concept research studies to evaluate the tool. And with that, I will now turn it over to Heather, who's going to talk more about findings from our focus groups and interviews and how those are guiding our design process. So Heather.
Thanks, Mark. Next slide, please. Right, so now that you know a little bit about how decision support aids work, the data that we're drawing from in order to inform what we're building and kind of the key decision points of the accommodation request process, I would like to spend some time kind of peeling back a layer to show you at a deeper level what we've built into this tool in terms of support aids. So at every decision stage, we're trying very intentionally to draw users' focus onto 2 dimensions that are always important, always present in the accommodation process. Those 2 dimensions are the personal and the environmental. So at every decision stage, we draw out, if not just remind users of their own assessments, their assessments of their confidence in and comfort with their knowledge of the accommodation process, both the law, but also the nitty-gritty of different types of accommodations, of what would work best, what's available to them. You know, for many employers, the first response they have when they receive an accommodation request is, sure, of course, but what do you need? Right? And this can be a place where both parties get stuck if there's not a lot of information out there about what's available. So we also want to highlight for people that these types of decisions are never just about the law, right? They're always also about an individual's beliefs about disclosure, sharing personal information, about help seeking, their overall beliefs about fairness, right? So building in support aids that keep users thinking about their own personal values while going through this process is part of the structure that we've built in there. And that, of course, means asking people to constantly reflect on the ways that their personal values put into a particular context impacts the way they see themselves. So it could be their identity or the way they see themselves as a worker or as a person who needs to do some things in a different way in order to get them done. This also means having a fairly honest reckoning of one's own risk tolerance. The costs and benefits and the acceptable threshold for balancing those costs and benefits are not the same for any 2 people. And just as we do with the personal, at every decision stage, we build in aids to help illuminate how the type of workplace that you're in, the type of accommodations that a person requests, the support networks available, both professional and personal support networks, these all play large roles in how the accommodation process unfolds and is likely to have important influences on, say, for example, somebody's risk tolerance in making that request. Next slide. So I want to briefly share with you some of the key findings that have come out of our study. Basically, there were 5 key themes that emerged out of the data we collected. The ordering here does not necessarily reflect their importance or prevalence, and I'm going to talk in a little more detail about each one. But the 5 themes that really stood out to us was risk analysis, negotiating strategies, settling for partial accommodations, retaliation or feeling punished for simply submitting an accommodation request, and role models. Next slide. So first I'm going to talk about risk analysis. And if you can go back one slide, I was just going to say, not to worry, this is intentionally blank. Next slide. We're just going to see a blank slide with a text. Perfect. So I just talked a little bit about risk analysis in terms of how we are embedding these individual support aids to address this issue. So the scoping review of other studies definitely informed us that we needed to include some means by which people can begin to assess their risk tolerance. And the way we've incorporated this has really been driven by what we heard, talking to all the individuals that Mark just mentioned and the focus groups and interviews we conducted. So all the participants with disabilities talked about the types of signals they looked for to get a sense of how inclusive the work environment is, such as things like explicit policy statements, instructions, clear instructions and procedures for requesting accommodations, or even looking around and seeing other employees using accommodations. So when discussing risk, most respondents were more concerned about their reputation being tarnished than anything else. So they talked about things like not wanting something placed on their employment record. They were concerned about being resented by fellow workers or overall being judged as less effective at their job simply by the mere request for an accommodation. Next slide. So one participant noted, quote, "The conversation happened only because the precondition was already met that I felt fairly confident that the information was not going to be used in a retaliatory or inappropriate fashion." This is a quote from Beatrice, a pseudonym, someone who has been in the workforce for quite some time and lives with cerebral palsy. So organizational or work culture was also a key factor that's considered when weighing the risk and benefits of requesting an accommodation. However, leadership, so the attitudes of direct supervisors, for example, played an even more prominent role in respondents' assessments of the work culture around accommodations and potential risks of even disclosing having a disability. Next slide. Here's a quote from Mary, a savvy HR manager who is well aware of this. And in fact, she told us, quote, "We heavily advertise that if you need some help doing your job, to please reach out to us. We have a post-offer health assessment form that candidates fill out, and on there is a specific question about requesting an accommodation. Part of my role for onboarding assessments is to review that, and if they answer yes to accommodation requests, then that opens up further dialogue as to what their needs are and how it fits with the essential functions of the job." End quote. So here we can directly see somebody who's aware of this dynamic and trying to just implement a mechanism for people to have that dialogue right into their hiring process. Next slide. So negotiation strategies. So our preliminary analysis indicates that negotiation strategies actually vary quite dramatically for participants along lines of things like length of time in the workforce. So particularly individuals who started their careers before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, compared to those who started their work careers after the ADA was passed. Also, a big dimension of difference was the degree of exposure to or immersion in disability communities, particularly disability communities that focused on disability rights and/or communities that celebrate and focus on disability pride. Very different strategies for folks depending on their incorporation into those types of groups. And lastly, we see that strategies differed depending on individuals' access to role models, whether or not folks had seen other disabled people in the workforce thriving and succeeding in their careers with accommodations. So these three factors, if you will, really shape how individuals approach negotiation when they're requesting accommodations. Next slide. So accepting or settling for partial accommodations is a very common theme among pretty much all of the participants with disabilities that responded to our study. So participants with both visible or apparent disabilities and those with invisible disabilities often reported requesting accommodations for their visible impairments, but not invisible impairments. So things like dyslexia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, mental health issues. Many participants, even if they were receiving accommodations for a physical or visible disability, were very reluctant to either disclose or even bring up some of the invisible impairments they may have. Additionally, folks with fluctuating or degenerative conditions expressed reluctance to update, change, or expand accommodations once they've received a set of accommodations. Almost all of our respondents indicated their first preference right off the bat was if they could in some way figure out how to accommodate themselves. They preferred to do that when possible before asking for any accommodations from their employers. Now, the findings on this theme really suggests that many folks with disabilities, even those who are actively using accommodations, are not being fully or not adequately accommodated at their jobs. And so our decision support aid has resources for individuals to read about some of the costs that come along with common forms of self-accommodation. So for example, some of those costs, it can include things like excessive fatigue during non-work hours, if someone's not getting the accommodation that they need during work hours. Neglected mental health issues can become acute crises that interrupt the workplace if they're left undisclosed and unmanaged. The impacts, for example, of other possible physical damage or physical impairments that can result from inadequate accommodations in a workplace. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, part of the risk analysis that individuals do is around this potential, real or perceived, for retaliation if accommodations are provided. Next slide. So here is a quote from Jasmine, one of the participants in our study. Jasmine says, quote, "I thankfully haven't had employers be mad about it, but I definitely have had peers. Definitely, especially when I had just gotten off workers' comp and just moved back in. I had a 10-pound weight limit, and so I was doing absolutely nothing hands-on, and there was a lot of hostility," end quote. So this finding also has important implications for the decision support aid. Next slide. So for example, we have tried to pull out ideas and other strategies that have been used for managing expectations of both supervisors, but also of other coworkers. Expectations that remain kind of an ongoing process, an ongoing dialogue for many people. So providing strategies for managing identity, for managing disclosure, how much, to whom, among coworkers, after an accommodation request has been granted, turns out that is equally important to one's quality of life on the job. And indeed, we heard from some employers ways that they have implemented or introduced an accommodation for a disabled employee that minimized the need for that employee to have to explain or justify the accommodation with others. And so this is, again, really one of the benefits of this kind of work is we're able to incorporate real examples from individuals who've used these strategies with success. Next slide. So lastly, I want to highlight the importance of having role models in the workplace for people with disabilities to feel comfortable to even discuss or inquire, more or less request an accommodation. But this is also important to see role models in order to be able to think more creatively about types of accommodations and how they can be used. So to really think through and recognize the degree of increased productivity that is possible with appropriate accommodations that are not always technologically advanced or expensive, etc. Sometimes it can be simple things that make a big difference. Next slide. So one of our participants living with blindness, Amy, told us, quote, "So like when my friends at company travel, they take a visual interpreter with them. When my blind friends at this company make a PowerPoint, they can set up a meeting with a visual interpreter to help them like format their slides. And that is what needs to happen more widespread. I've seen my blind friends like in action with their visual interpreters, and I think it's been a really good model," end quote. And we're sharing this quote because this is an example of Amy has had a lot of success in getting the accommodations that she needs in workplaces. But a lot of the go-to accommodations that people kind of automatically think would be helpful for a blind employee, some of those don't necessarily help Amy that much, where she's had ideas about other things that are really effective. Next slide. Right, and so again, here we are trying to build in these kind of vignettes, these examples for folks, particularly if for those individuals who maybe have never seen a disabled person in the workforce using an accommodation. And I know I don't need to say this to this audience, but just statistically speaking, if you're at a workplace that's got more than 50 employees, believe me, you got folks in there that are people with disabilities, whether you know it or not, but we may not be aware of them. So, without exception, frankly, the disabled participants in our study really discuss the importance of, and most frequently, the stark lack of role models for disabled people thriving successfully in their jobs who neither minimize their disability nor their accommodations. So role models play an important or key role for affirming disability identity, but also as concrete examples, again, of how accommodations can be creatively and successfully implemented. Connection to a strong support network of positive disability communities were really important factors for all respondents who reported having really successfully obtained job accommodations that allowed them to maximize their productivity at work. Next slide. So I just wanted to give you a little taste of some of the qualitative findings so that you can get a better sense of the types and breadth of material that we're drawing on in order to build in supports at each of these different stages that individuals go through as they think about the accommodation process. What's interesting to me, someone who's been studying this for quite some time, this study really highlighted some large gaps in the existing literature about workplace accommodations. Again, those include things like the importance of employers signaling genuinely inclusive workspaces, right? That is recognizing, acknowledging disability as part of diversity, inclusion, and equity. This work really highlights the lack of strategies out there for managing expectations of supervisors, of coworkers around disability after an accommodation has been implemented. We still live in a society where we don't talk a lot about disability. It is somewhat mysterious to many folks who don't identify as disabled. And as a result, just the presence of an accommodation, just the signal of someone being disabled can lead to a variety of assumptions or stereotypes that may or may not be appropriate or relevant to the individual with that accommodation. And there hasn't been a lot of research providing individuals tools with how do you have that conversation with a coworker to kind of set and manage their expectations and not allow the kinds of assumptions and stigma, disability stigma, to balloon into a negative kind of workspace. And then lastly, again, our findings really highlight this need for role models. Again, that people with disabilities who are openly discussing accommodations in workplaces and talking about it in ways that normalize the fact that all of us at some point in our life will experience impaired functioning, if not disability. Next slide. So again, bringing us kind of back out, the decision support aid is in development, and we're in the process right now of getting feedback from a subgroup of the folks who participated in our study. Right, but again, the main structure consists of supports at each decision stage to learn about the accommodation process, but is also to learn about oneself as they kind of move through thinking about what's important in the reasonable accommodation process. Also, this prompts individuals to actively reflect on the specific circumstances and contexts in which users find themselves. And then to provide support so that individuals can take action, can use kind of these actionable items that allow folks to apply what they've discovered about themselves, discovered about their work environment, discovered about their risk tolerance, etc., in order to make the best decision for them at that moment. And again, I just want to reiterate what Dr. Harniss started with, is in recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all answer for individuals, and that not everyone really would get the most benefit out of making an accommodation request in a particular environment at a particular time. So our decision aid is, again, really aimed at helping people work through this process, but it's not at trying to move people into any particular end goal. Next slide. So as I said, we'll be receiving and incorporating feedback from a small team over the next the next 2 months. And we plan to pilot the decision support aid, which a much larger test group in the fall, so fall 2021. I also want to emphasize that while I presented much of this information as being targeted at workers with disabilities, the support aid tool that we're developing is aimed at a much broader audience. Our intended users include, obviously, workers with disabilities, but also includes employers, human resource managers, vocational rehabilitation counselors, basically anyone who wants to learn more about reasonable accommodations in the workplace that are provisioned under the Americans with Disabilities Act. We are going to take questions in just a moment, but I just want to highlight that when I said that we're going to be test piloting this tool with a larger group in the fall, that's me putting out a plug that if you're interested in potentially participating in that kind of study or want to give us feedback or follow up in any way, of course, we have listed our email addresses for Mark and myself, and we are always happy to hear from you. Next slide. And with that, we want to open up to your questions or comments. I'm eager to hear your thoughts about this. We want to sincerely thank you for attending this webinar and being here with us today. Thank you.
So we do have a few questions in the Q&A. And Angelica, if you want to stop the share, that might be easier. Perfect. All right. So Heather, I'll start with one of the harder ones. What if my employer doesn't follow the ADA? I have multiple health issues, including stage 4 cancer. I literally don't have time to repeatedly advocate for myself over and over. I'm an associate professor at a federally funded institute. When I asked for an accommodation and automatic door opener, it took 15 months. I don't have 15 months to wait for something I need. My health definitely allows me to work, though, with minor accommodations. I will start, and then I'm going to turn it back to you. But I'll start just by, first of all, acknowledging the reality and the commonality of that experience, and certainly empathizing with you in that experience. I think that you highlight something that we all know, that we are 31 years past the initial passage of the ADA, and we're still working to implement the ADA in the context where it applies. So that doesn't help, obviously, but I do think that what you're saying is something that we heard in our focus groups as people talked about their own analysis. There's the way the law is supposed to work, and then there's the way that it all kind of plays out in real life. And so I think that what we heard from people is, I left jobs instead of pushing accommodations. I made decisions to not push forward with legal action or complaints because it was too much of a demand on my energy to do that. So I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying, acknowledging that is part of the experience that people with disabilities are having around employment and accommodations. So Heather, do you have any additional thoughts about that?
No, I mean, just to echo, I guess, of course I have additional thoughts.
Of course.
Mark is one of my favorite people to work with because we banter back and forth on these things. Again, I would echo that, yeah, this is not uncommon. I would also, I can't help but mention that somewhat ironically that institutions of higher education, this is an extremely common frustration, is the inability to adequately accommodate faculty and staff. For the student side, we're making some progress. What I would say to you is my understanding is that all federally funded institutions of higher education, for example, have a Title IX coordinator, or Title IX coordinator, or as well as an ADA coordinator office. I bring that up because for some reason, they're often mushed together. We just recently at our university had them separated out, but I would encourage you to directly contact your ADA coordinator for that institution, because you're right, you can't wait 15 months, and often that will be one of the channels through which you can apply a little pressure.
And I'll just note that in chat, I believe it's Barbara said that you can certainly file a complaint, and recommends Office of Federal Compliance Programs or Civil Rights. And then Lawanda just supports what you said, and that academia is a setting that expects and rewards hyper-productivity, right? There's a model there, yeah.
And I'm sorry, Mark, but I would also add that higher education has also got a really clear set of metrics that they use to measure productivity, which can be very problematic.
Yeah. Lawanda suggests also the campus ombudsman that might be able to assist. They often, I agree, are a great resource on universities. Good, thank you. And so then another question from Deborah George. You mentioned essential functions. As a university, programs list their own essential functions for their students. We send our students out to clinical sites. Should we recommend that those clinical sites also have essential functions? Sure, I think so. I mean, I think the more clarity that's possible, the better. And you know, there are guidelines, essential functions, essential duties. It's tricky. What's essential about a job, right? What is required versus sort of secondary? And there are lots of ways, as you probably know, that gets figured out. It's partially the employer's judgment. It's partially the written job description. It's about how much time is spent on the function, but the more clarity there is around essential functions, the easier it's going to be for people with disabilities to do the analysis. Am I able to do those things? To have those clearly operationalized, and for supervisors to make the same analysis. And then, you know, then the focus can become, what are the accommodations that reduce barriers, rather than, oh, you can't do X, therefore you can't do this whole job, which is sometimes what happens.
Yeah, I would just echo that and say that my advice to anybody who passes through my classrooms is, for any job that you get, make sure that you get the job description in writing with the essential functions and the time allotment kind of broken out. And oftentimes employers will be a little startled, like, well, we've given you the job, why do you need that? But it's so critical. And it's critical, I mean, you never know when you may need an accommodation, whether you're identified as disabled or not. And so having that information written down is really important. I know that even again, I'm academic, so I'm going to speak about that with our teaching assistants, I pushed to have a clear set of essential job functions identified, and, you know, just kind of friendly reminded the chair of my old department, that not having that information clarified really opened us up for students or teaching assistants to say, well, I do this and not this and this. If it's not written down, it's really hard to have that conversation. Yes.
Yeah. And Jeannie Hansel notes in chat that your local PNA, Protection and Advocacy Agency, might also be able to offer assistance regarding accommodations at school and at work. Yeah, good. So there are just a couple more questions here. Cindy says, I'm a CRC that supports clients that go out in the workplace. I'm their counselor. If a client comes to me and says that their supervisor does not have patience for their disability and their job coach backs this up, should this be brought to the attention of HR? The client is having issues with certain behaviors in the workplace. And I think, yes, right? In part, what you probably want to think through is, are those behaviors things that, for which reasonable accommodation might result in changes that would ensure their ability to complete the essential duties of the job successfully? The more, I think, overt you can be about the need for accommodation and the request for accommodation. I mean, technically, you know, the accommodations don't have to be like a specific request. If somebody tells you that they're having a problem related to something that seems like a disability, you as an employer need to respond to that. But a lot of employers don't, or don't know that they need to. And so if there's a need for accommodation, if you think accommodation will help this client, then figuring that out, formalizing it, really engaging in that rights activation, I think can be very powerful. And in that process, for better or for worse, a lot of people find they have to educate people. And this is a space where a lot of people with disabilities do a lot of free labor to teach other people about how the law works. And so, so that might be a place where you as a support for that client could also engage in that education. Yeah. Okay. Then here's a question. This is a Heather question. You mentioned that people sometimes self-accommodate. What are examples of self-accommodations, and are there any downsides to doing that?
Yeah, so examples of self-accommodation can be things like, for example, speaking to a woman who had she could use a power wheelchair, or she could use a set of arm crutches, a combination of like a walker and or some arm crutches. And her work environment was mostly accessible with her crutches or walker, but not so much for her power chair. And so rather than ask for any modifications, she worked for 15 years in this particular physical environment using her arm crutches. And as a result, she now has lasting and permanent damage in both of her shoulders, because that was one of the reasons why she was encouraged to use her power chair instead. So that was the kind of trade-off that she hadn't anticipated, but that resulted from avoiding or just I'll figure it out rather than asking for a modification. Another example, a common one is, for example, talking to a young woman who it was just everybody at the particular job she was at stood in order to do that job. And as a result of standing all day, she was so exhausted by the time the workday was done, she really couldn't do anything else. And so it really was not allowing her to engage in work-life balance in an important way. And it was another interesting story, because it was about a couple decades later, she said, man, all I really needed was a stool. Like all I needed was to be able to reserve some of that physical energy. So that's an example of kind of self-accommodation rather than asking for accommodations. And I would follow up, Cindy also in the Q&A asked about, do we have examples of a person asked for an accommodation and how it worked for them? One that was interesting to me is we talked to a participant who said that they had hyperreflexivity, and as a result, anything would kind of over startle that person. And it wasn't necessarily a problem so much as it was the way coworkers would respond if they came up to ask her a question, and she would just kind of be over startled. And so it was a simple thing of she hung a chime near the door of her office and asked that when people came in, just make a noise so that she knew that she was about to be engaged, for example. So just sometimes small things like that took some brainstorming. And this was an idea that she got from an online chat group with other individuals who had her condition that resulted in hyperreflexivity. So that would be an example of a very small accommodation.
Any other questions or even comments? Yeah, go ahead.
So there's another question that just came in.
Yes.
That says, do you think stigma of disabilities in the workplace will be resolved? Mark, would you like to start off on that?
Would I like to start off with that very small question? Sure. It's hard to think about where to start with that, because stigma about disability, the history of disability documents the ways in which people with disabilities have been discriminated against, the stigma that's been associated with disability, and the ways in which society has responded to that, which in very early days was really isolation, segregation, separation, Over time, best practice became institutionalization, right? Separation, sort of ignoring some disability and institutionalizing other types of disability. Moving into, I think, a phase where we find ourselves now, which is a focus on inclusion and integration. There was a period of time in history where the focus was integration. It was, at least let's have people with disabilities in the same spaces, even if they're not doing the same things, right? And then now really focusing on inclusion. I think when you look at the field of disability studies, and the things that I love to read about that challenge me a lot are coming from folks who are talking about disability justice. And disability justice goes beyond inclusion to not just accepting it, including people, providing accommodations, but to actually celebrating that people have different bodies and different minds, and we all have different bodies and different minds, that there is beauty there. I think there's this great quote, which I'm going to forget who said it, but there's no one way to live in a body, you know. And so, will stigma in the workplace be resolved? I think to the extent that we as societies can continue to move forward on a path where we develop more sophisticated understandings about really the range and diversity of human experience and human embodiment and all of that kind of thing. So that's all to say that it's not going to happen tomorrow, right? This is a big long-term project.
It is, and I would just add that I think some of what has maintained that stigma about disability in the workplace is the fact that in our own federal laws, we have some very different, one could argue, potentially contradictory definitions of what it means to be disabled. So for example, you know, many people are much more familiar with the Social Security disability insurance program. And here's a definition of disability by the federal government that is really, it hinges on work. They define being disabled as being unable to work. And that really sticks in people's minds. And then, you know, the ADA, this is a civil rights protection piece of legislation that's trying to do a whole lot in addition to just, you know, kind of establish a protected class. And so for many folks, they still struggle with the idea of, well, doesn't being disabled mean unable to work? And I think that the way that we break that down, as in you and I, those of us who are in this virtual space together, is by talking about it, by normalizing disability, by being visible in the workplace. I for the most part, have non-apparent impairments. And so that means that someone like myself, I have to disclose that I'm disabled in order to let people know that that's present in our space. So I would say celebrate disability pride, and again, to Mark's point about learning more about disability justice are all great ways to start to dismantle that stigma about disability in the workplace.
Excellent. All right, I think we're at time.
We are. So I just want to thank our speakers, Mark Harniss and Heather Evans, for their fabulous presentation today. I want to be sure that our participants get an opportunity to provide us feedback and the evaluation. And thank everyone for attending our webinar today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all.
Good to talk.